Hello, this is the Bite Weasel, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at how we can make some quick improvements to our overall build. So last episode we spent some time improving our game UI. We sort of added these cool looking icons, we created this settings window with these nice looking sliders that you can move around, and sort of an OK button that toggles it closed. And it looks pretty good. But if I sort of hide this settings window now with the visible property here, what we see behind it is, well, it's a little less impressive. It's basically the pure template that we got when we created the game. We added a couple of plots and then we sort of immediately started building our tycoon. So I think it might be time to just spend a bit of our energy improving the overall world, right? So, bearing in mind, I'm not a builder, as you can probably tell from our awesome upgraders and droppers. But I do want to make this tutorial series a sort of a complete series that shows you how to go from that pure baseplate template that we started with all the way up to a fully published game that looks pretty decent when someone joins it, right? So there are plenty of YouTube tutorials out there that will show you how to make an awesome build and an awesome world by creating custom models in Blender, importing them into Roblox Studio, messing with game lightings and shadows and all of that good stuff. But I'm just going to show you some very basic things that you can do to improve from the base plate to something that looks okay, right? We're going to make use of the toolbox and textures and models from there, and then some basic changes here. So it won't look like the best build in the world, but at least it will give you an idea of where to start, and then you can go away on your own and sort of spend more time than I have in this video to create something that you really like. So where should we start? Well, I think what we should start with is the spawn location. So right now, when you spawn, it hits this spawn location. It's actually in the hierarchy called spawn location. And then you just walk forward into the plot. I think we should make a slightly nicer spawn location and then sort of create these plots in a circle around that spawn location. Now, some tycoons have things in a straight line, some that have them like spread out across the map. We're going to do like a simple circle. So what we can do is we can add a new cylinder part. We can name it sort of like center, which is going to be the center of the map. And then we can sort of change its size. And I think a good size would be something like half a stud high and then pretty big 80/80, right? Something like this. Now you can obviously go away and choose a different sort of size, whatever might fit for your game. But we need to make sure that it is positioned in the center. And I guess we need to start moving some of these things out of the way so at least we can see what we're doing. So there is our center piece. And if I move this spawn point out of the way and then select my centerpiece and make sure that it is touching the ground with collisions turned on, you can then move it and it will sort of hit the ground. Then we want this spawn point sort of exactly in there, right on top, but we don't really want it visible. So we can get rid of that texture that it's got on there, and we can sort of turn up the transparency to hide this thing and make sure that no one can collide with it. So now if you were to join into the game, you would spawn right in this piece and you would be stood on this center piece. But remember that when we add a new part, we do need to anchor it. Otherwise, it's going to sort of bounce around with all the physics. So that looks okay. And then what we can do is we can sort of duplicate that and make it a little bit thinner. So maybe only 2.5 high and a bit wider, maybe 90. Is that too wide? I'm not sure. But that looks okay. And then we want it touching the ground, but right now it's going to be colliding with this. So I think if we turn off collisions with that one, and then make sure that this one is then touching the ground, and then turn this one back on with collisions, and change their colors. So this bottom one could be sort of a black, I guess. And the center one can be, I don't know, a slightly darker gray. Sure. So obviously spend more time sort of coming up with a nice looking uh, level for your game, but that doesn't look too bad. And then what we can do is we can add some textures onto this to make it look a little better. So we can go over to our toolbox and make a search for something like texture pack. And here is a pretty nice one from Dev for Hire. So certainly check those guys out if you end up using this for your game. But you can see, much like we had that icon pack last time, it's basically a little model, although this one does not include any scripts because we didn't get that warning, that has a whole bunch of different textures that you can use in your game. So what I think I want to use for this centerpiece is maybe this one over here, which sort of looks like a nice bit of concrete. So we can select that and we can sort of copy this texture itself and then go over to our centerpiece and sort of paste that in there, right? Now, when you copy a texture, it might not be on the correct face. So you do have to go down to face and choose which one is correct for you. Now, you'd think it'd be the top, but cylinders are sort of oriented a different direction to like blocks. So for our case, it's actually the right face that we want. And already that looks not too bad. You can go away and sort of customize the transparency. So whether you want more of the texture showing or less of the texture showing. But whatever we had by default was not bad, actually. And the other thing you can look at is this studs per tile value, which has an across and an up and down, U and V. And this is basically how many studs it takes before the texture repeats. So this is 9 studs before you see the texture repeat. But if I change it to something like 1, you'll see that it repeats really, really quickly. So you can mess around with these values to sort of give your game the sort of texture that you want. But I think 9 wasn't too bad the way that we had it before. But those are some cool values that you can change. Now, the other thing I want to do is sort of change this base plate itself. So this is the sort of entire world that spans all over there. What I want to do is use a texture for that and then change its color to sort of green. So I think this one here is a pretty nice one with these leaves on it. What we can do is we can sort of copy that texture just like we did before and then paste it into our base plate. Now it's already got a texture, so let's just get rid of that one. And then again, sort of pick the correct face. And it's probably top because I bet the base plate is a block. So there you go. That looks not too bad. And then what we should do is change the color to a green of some kind, right? So it kind of looks like grass. You can also mess around with the material. That's another thing that sort of changes the way these things look. And I personally like the look of concrete because it just sort of removes some of that specular highlight from the lighting and it sort of gives it this grain texture. I know grass doesn't really look the same as concrete, but I personally like this as a neat looking thing. So we can change the transparency as well, make the leaves easier to see or harder to see. I think I want them harder to see, so it's just like barely there, but it does look a little nicer that it's green instead of that basic base plate that we had at the beginning. So that's not too bad already. But the next thing I want to do is add a skybox. So right now we have the basic skybox, which is just a blue sort of square that goes from blue down to white. But you can certainly find a bunch of skyboxes in the toolbox. So we can search for something like, oh, I don't know, weather sky. And there is a whole bunch to choose from. We can pick this one here. That's by Quaymod or something. I don't know how to pronounce the name, but I think it looks pretty neat. So we can sort of add that into our game. And already it's starting to look a lot better than it was before. So something to be aware of when you do add the skybox is, of course, to get rid of that original skybox. So go over here under lighting, that's where skyboxes get added, and sort of delete that old one. So now we have just the new skybox in there, which looks pretty neat. And then the next thing that we kind of want is probably some sort of tree model, right? So we can say, I don't know, cartoon tree, and see if there's any good ones in the toolbox. So this one by, what does that say? Space Dud 10. I don't know. This one looks pretty good. And so you can sort of import those from the toolbox and sort of spread them around your world and make it look not too shabby at all. So there we go. We have a very basic spawn point. We have a tree model that we're going to use, and we have these textures. Should we be in need of more textures? I think for now we can just sort of get rid of that and now position these plots around our circular spawn point. To do that, let's first move this template out of the way so it doesn't get in there and sort of delete plot 2 and plot 3. Right, let's focus only on plot 1 and get it into the right position, and then we can sort of rotate the other ones around. So plot 1 wants to start at the spawn location, which is going to be 0 and 0. So it's right in the center now. Then we can move it out as many studs as we want. So I think 160 might be pretty good. Then what we're going to do is duplicate plot 1 and call it plot 2. So it's currently in that exact same position. But if we go down to the pivot point, what we can do is set the pivot point to be the opposite of where it currently is. So you can see its current position is 160 and then some value up. We want it to pivot around minus 160, which should be the exact center point. So when you set that, you'll see that these move handles are now all the way in the center. So if I change over to the rotate tool and rotate it by 45 degrees, you'll see that it's in that exact position that we want. Then we can sort of duplicate that, name it plot 3, and rotate it around, and duplicate that one. You know, you can obviously see where I'm going with this. Plot 4, duplicate it around, and so on and so on. So I will continue to do this until I have all of them in the right location. It's actually faster to just duplicate it and then go back, probably, and update them. But one thing you do want to make sure is that once you're done with that, you set the pivot position back to 0 so that you're pivoting around its original location instead of the center point. So that's 3, 4, and then this one will be 5. Then, of course, 6. So I'm going to have a server that allows, I guess, 8 players to play at the same time. But you can, of course, have more or fewer plots depending on what your layout looks like and how many people you want playing the game at the same time. So there we go. Now we have those plots sort of around our starting circle. Let's now duplicate some of these trees around the map so we can switch to move, make sure collisions is turned on, and then duplicate these things and make sure that they end up correctly in the ground. In fact, let's use select instead of move. So that should be correct on the ground now, not poking up into the map or poking on top of another tree like that. And you can spend some time making sure that your world looks good. Of course, I only have a short amount of time in this video, but it gives you some idea of how you can make your game, look a little better than the default base plate. Not that much better, at least the way I do it, but hopefully you spent more time. And there you go. So definitely go away and maybe find different tree models, make some of your own, and there you go. Now it's already looking pretty good, but what we need to do is sort of fix up our lighting a little bit. So right now, you probably noticed as I zoom in and out, we get this like really foggy, sort of washed out feeling, which I don't like. Maybe you like that for the theme of your game, but I would prefer that it didn't look like that. So I'm going to go down into the lighting setting, which sort of has a whole bunch of different colors and numbers that you can sort of mess around with. And I'm going to set these to some values that I think look okay, but there's definitely a bunch of tutorials out there that teach you all about how to do lighting correctly. So for now, I'm just going to use the following numbers. I'm going to set the ambient lighting to a whiter color so it looks much brighter than it did before. Then I'm going to change the color shift top to also be white, and that's sort of the color that it gives at the top of the screen versus down at the bottom of the screen. So color shift bottom, then I'll make a sort of green color. Not that it really matters too much because everything is already green, but you can go away and you can spend some time changing these values. Like the global brightness I can turn down. Whoops, didn't mean to click away. And then we can also change the outdoor ambient to be white as well, just to sort of brighten it up a little bit. Then the last thing I'm going to do is add a color correction effect to my lighting. And this sort of gives you the option to correct some of the default colors that the sort of service gives you. And the only thing I'm really going to change is the contrast by turning it up just a bit. To get rid of some of that feeling of fogginess. So there you go. This might not look great to you, and you are probably correct in that case. I am not a builder expert, but I think it looks pretty nice. So there we go. We have a world now that looks a lot nicer than it did before. We basically just changed the base plate. We've added this centerpiece, and we have our plots spread around it. Next up, I want to add a circular path around this piece. So in some tycoons that are laid out straight, they have this sort of conveyor belt system that allows players to run up and down quickly between the plots. Now, we don't have a straight up and down sort of plot layout. Instead, we have this circular one, but I still want that convenient speed travel time run path. So we can make that by sort of duplicating this centerpiece. I guess we can rename it path, and we can increase its size, maybe by like 112 instead of 90. Then we need to basically cut away the center of this to make a ring. And the way you can do that is by duplicating another piece and setting its size to however much you want to cut out of that path part. So we'll say 95. Then make sure it's bigger in both the height and the depth. No, wait, in both the both directions of the y-axis. Then you can actually click this piece and say negate. And what this will do is it will basically turn it into a piece that when combined with another part will cut a hole from that other part. So if you select the negative part and then select the path part, you can click union to combine those things together and actually create this piece then that has a hole cut out of it. So you can see the grass there between those pieces. Now, that union is kind of special because you can't actually change the color of it. Instead, it takes the color from the original piece. So if you want to change the color, make sure the original piece color is changed first. So say we wanted a sort of dark stone gray, make the path that color, then combine these two pieces together with a union. And you'll see that it's sort of taken that piece there. So we can do that exact same thing and basically end up with another ring around there. And then what we can do with these paths, like the outer path and the inner path, say inner path, is we can change their assembly angular velocity. Now, linear velocity we sort of saw before with our conveyor belt, and it basically makes things that are sitting on it move faster up and down. Well, angular velocity is very similar, except it moves them around in a circle, which is kind of what we want because this is a circular path. So for the inner path, we will make it 0.4 in the y-axis. In fact, negative 0.4, because we want them to go the other way. And then the outer path, I think I probably already set it to 0.4 in the positive axis. So now, as long as both of those things are both of those things are anchored, we should be good to test it out. So if I play the game now, first, this is what our new spawn location looks like. Is it good? It's all right. But if I go over here and I stand on one of these things, you should see that I start traveling. So this is going to make it much easier to get to one of these other plots. And then if I stand on the outer one, I will start traveling in that way. So it's basically just a convenient way to sort of travel between these things much faster than normal. Whee! And woo! So there you go. I think I want a bit more grass separation between these things. But so far, it is not too bad at all. To do that, we can basically take this centerpiece, which I guess is not really the center, it's a step of some kind, and just make it a little bit smaller. How about 84? That should give us more grass separation between those paths. And then this texture, I want to just change up a little bit. Make it like that, and then change the color so it's a bit darker. So it blends more in with that path, I think. Something like that. There we go. So obviously spend more time tweaking these settings, getting the colors all looking right, and getting it laid out nice for your game. But compared to what we started with at the beginning of this video, I think this is way, way better. Write a comment down below if you agree or disagree, and I will take those into consideration for the next video. So now we have this workspace with all these different things in. It might be nice to just tidy it up a little bit. We can add a new folder. We can call it like trees, if I can spell, and then sort of copy in all of these trees by selecting them all, moving them into our trees folder. There, at least we can get rid of those from our hierarchy now. And we can sort of do a similar thing with the spawn point. So the center or the spawn area will have that step and those paths. And I guess the spawn location, although that doesn't really matter, in there. So that will be that. I do want to sort of mess around with this lighting, probably between episodes, because it's a bit intense in some areas. But there we go. That's what we've got. Though there is a problem with our code. So finally in this episode, we'll actually write some code right at the end when you've probably already stopped watching the video. But there is a problem where these plots, because we've rotated them now, some of the things are not working correctly. So for example, if I deleted plot 1 just to show you, so that when I spawn in, I actually get assigned a different plot, which is plot 2 by the looks of things. If I go over here now, you see how this sign is so bright? I need to change the lighting settings. But what you'll notice is that the conveyor belt is conveyoring things at a angle now, which is not what we want at all. So let's show you how to fix that. So the way that we fix that is basically where we clone the plot. So if you remember in our factory script, we have a function near the top called clone plot right here. So if you recall, this basically grabs that template, clones it out, which includes all of its children, and then just moves it into that plot location. Well, what we need to do is actually look through all the children pieces and see if any of them have an assembly velocity. And if they do, we need to make sure that assembly velocity is rotated in the same orientation as the plot point, right? So we can do that right in this loop here that sort of goes through all the children anyway. We can check to see if the part that we're looking at is a base part, right? Because if it's not a base part, like it's a texture or something, it's not going to have a linear assembly velocity. So if it is a base part and it has an assembly linear velocity that isn't equal to just the default one, which I guess is 0, then we need to do something special. And what we need to do is basically rotate the velocity, right? We don't really want Roblox to help us out because it's probably going to get it wrong. What we need to do is figure out what the pivot point is of the template, right? So what is the pivot point of the template? That is going to be template get pivot, right? We've already seen this before in several other places. You get the pivot point, but we want it of the template. And now we want to compare the difference between the template's pivot and the plot's pivot. So let's get the plot's pivot. And I've called it CF for C-frame because really that's what the get pivot thing returns. So we'll plot get pivot. And then we need to calculate the difference between that. So what is the relative difference between those two things? So it's going to be the template's plot to object space. And that basically converts one thing into an absolute position instead to a position relative to whatever you send in. So what is it relative to the plot's position? And then we can basically set the part's assembly linear velocity to be that relative location's coordinates that we did, but we just want the rotation piece, right? That's going to give us a nice rotation that is the difference between what the template is and what the plot is. And then we can multiply by whatever the part original thing was, right? So we get the template's position, we get the plot's position, we calculate the difference between those two things, and then we take that different rotation and just make sure that we've multiplied it to this. So if this is like 90 degrees and the plot is, 180 degrees, then those things multiplied together will be what we need the conveyor belt to look like. So now if we go back in, which one is my claimed plot? This is a problem we need to solve. So it's over there. We should see that it is working correctly. And you can see that it is no longer being pivoted off there. It is instead going correct. Neat. So make sure that you add that bit of code into your factory script to make sure that the belt works correctly. I think we could also write a little bit of code to sort of help solve that problem of when you start the game, you have no idea which tycoon is yours. I guess it's always behind you if it's plot one. That's unfortunate. But a lot of tycoon games have a sort of teleport button that allows you to return to your plot whenever you need to. So why don't we just add that and write the code to do that? Because it should be pretty straightforward. So if we go down to our UI and we open our UI frame and we go into this controls frame that we added, we can duplicate this button and call it teleport. It's going to be a teleport button. And similar to how we looked last episode, we can add a layout control to sort of make sure that this button is positioned in the correct way. And we can do a list layout, but change the list layout from fill direction vertical to instead horizontal. And you'll see these things then go next to each other, which I think is what we want. And we can add a tiny bit of padding in here too. So it looks nice. Now all we need to do is sort of change that icon. So what we could do is go back to our toolbox. We could search that icon pack back up. Maybe I should have kept it in the world. But for now, that's fine. Here it is again. Yes, we know about that script. Although you should really double check that script if you're going to keep it in case they've changed it between you looking at it. But we want a teleport button, and there's this one right here, which I'm guessing they called teleport. It's right here. And we can copy that texture and paste it into our UI in the teleport button's image. Right there. And now we have what looks to be a teleport icon. So we can once again get rid of these things, although we might end up using them again at some point. Now back in our code, which lives in the client GUI script, we can grab access to that button in the same way that we grabbed the settings button. We can add a teleport button. Teleport button, oops, teleport with a T, is controls wait for teleport button, like that. And then we can just add a mouse down handler, same way that we added one for the settings button or the OK button. The teleport button will now have one. That's cool. And now we need to make it do something when they press that. Now, what we could do is we could move our player's position right here by saying something like local player dot position equals plot position. The problem is this script runs on the client. The problem is that this code runs on the client, and the client doesn't really know anything about its plot. So what we should do is sort of send a message over to the server and have it move our player to our plot. But how do we send a message to the server? Well, we've already done that once before with this data update function. So we could just reuse it again and change the message that we send to be something like teleport. We don't need an extra value in there. So now over in our factory script, right at the bottom where we listen to those messages, we can add a new thing in here. We can say else if message equals teleport, then do something. What do we need to do? We need to find the player's plot that is assigned to them. Then we can move that player's character from wherever they are to the plot's pivot point, aka the center of that plot. Right? We already have a mechanism for sort of finding a player's plot. We use it here in the rebirth event and probably somewhere else, like here in the removing event. So if we're going to copy and paste this into a third position, at that point, you probably think it would be nicer to make a local function because then you only have that complicated bit of code once. So we'll make a local function and we'll call it get factory plot for, and then you pass in the player that you want to get it for. It looks like that. And then it basically is that same code where we loop through all the factories in the workspace. We grab the owner attribute from each one and check that it matches the player. And if we find it, then that's the matching factory, and the plot is in that storage table of factories that we used before. So then you can just return out the factory and the plot. If you don't find anything, because we get here and there's absolutely nothing, then we can return nil. So now in those two existing places where we sort of do this logic, we can now say local factory, comma plot equals get the factory for the player. Right? And if not factory because it didn't work, or not plot because it didn't work for that, then return early. Otherwise, do the existing code, which in this case was to set the factory to nil, destroy it, and sort of clone a new one because the player was leaving, so we need a new factory there ready for the next person. And in Rebirth, it's very similar. Instead of cloning the plot and being done, we then assign that back to the player. Because the player is still in the game, we just want their factory to start again. So that's cool. Now we have this nice function that we can use to grab the player's plot location. So we can say plot.getPivot, and that is the location that we want to send them to. So their send location is plot.pivot. And then what you'd need to do is get player.character and call set pivot, pivot to, and then that location, send. And this would work reasonably well if I play the game now. you'll see we have this nice shiny teleport button. I can click it and we get put into the plot. But if you're looking very carefully, what you might notice is that we sort of rise up out of the floor, right? And that's because we're teleporting our player's position, which is around the top of their legs, to the pivot point of the factory, which is actually the floor right there. So your legs go inside the floor. So to fix that, we actually need to teleport them just above the factory's pivot point. So we can do that by essentially changing this value. So instead of the exact pivot point, we can say add on a bit of a direction. So a direction is a vector 3. We can say new. We want it 0 in the x-axis, a little bit in the y-axis, and 0 in the z-axis or z-axis. So this should teleport us up a little bit. For example, if I change it to something more obvious, like 5, and I play the game, when I press this, you should see that we actually fall down a bit. Right? That isn't as obvious as I thought it was going to be, so maybe 5 is a good value. But if I made it really obvious by changing it to 15, you should see that we fall a long way, right? So there you go. Maybe 5 was a good value to use. So we've definitely now teleport to the correct place. Let's use 5. And we are above it. We're not stuck in the ground. We are falling slightly, so it's not an exact number, but it's okay. So there you go. Now when you spawn into the game, to find your assigned factory, you can just press your teleport button. And there we are. You can continue to build as normal and play the game. So that's really handy. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, leave a comment, ring that notification bell, all that good stuff, and I will see you next time.